Deep inside the ruins of Chernobyl, where the concrete has begun to sag like tired flesh and the steel beams groan when the wind pushes against the sarcophagus, there is a darkness that does not feel empty. It is a darkness that seems to hold its breath, a darkness that remembers. People imagine that the reactor is silent now, cold, lifeless, abandoned by everything except the ghosts of the men who died there. But if you stand long enough near the sealed doors of the destroyed reactor hall, if you listen not with your ears but with something deeper, you begin to understand that the building is not as dead as it looks. Something stirs inside it. Something small. Something patient. Something born after the world fled. They say life cannot exist in the heart of a nuclear ruin. They say nothing survives under levels of radiation that melt cameras, kill batteries, and silence Geiger counters. But life is stubborn. It survives earthquakes, ice ages, wars, fires, floods. And in Chernobyl, life did more than survive. It changed. It adapted. It found cracks to live in, shadows to fill, ways to twist itself around the invisible fire that still leaks from the skeleton of Reactor 4. The deeper you go, the more you feel it, the sense that something is watching, not with eyes, but with presence. A quiet persistence that lingers in the stale, metallic air. The first signs appeared years after the explosion, when the panic had faded and the world had turned its eyes elsewhere. Engineers who worked inside the early sarcophagus began to notice movement where there should have been none. Tiny blurs against the concrete, quick shadows crossing beams, threads of silk drifting in places untouched by wind. At first, they dismissed it as dust, or hallucination, or the tricks that radiation plays on a tired mind. But then they saw the shapes more clearly. Spiders, small, fast, darting between cracks in the walls. They were building webs in the broken infrastructure of the reactor, creating warped patterns across twisted metal and molten remains. Their webs were strange, misshapen, asymmetrical, collapsing inward instead of spiraling outward, as if the radiation that wrapped their tiny bodies had rewired something inside them. Yet they moved with purpose, with clarity, with an instinct sharpened by necessity rather than dimmed by poison. The workers didn't talk about them, not officially. No one wanted to be the one to report life thriving where death was supposed to reign. But in half-whispered conversations, in break rooms stained with graphite dust, in the quiet moments when a man wonders whether the metallic taste in his mouth is radiation or fear, the stories spread. There were spiders, there were webs, and they were growing deeper inside the ruins. As time passed, other creatures began to appear, small ones at first, insects with shells darker than night, ants marching in lines through hallways where the Geiger counter ticked like a ticking clock. Beetles crawling across surfaces still warm with radiation. They didn't flee from hotspots. They didn't hesitate at thresholds. They simply moved, as if the invisible storm around them meant nothing. As if the walls that once burned men alive were just another habitat, another landscape to claim. Then someone saw the first mouse, pale, almost white, its fur thin, its body lean, its eyes cloudy. It darted across a collapsed panel of concrete, paused near a patch of black fungus, and slipped into a hole melted through the floor. That mouse should not have existed. The radiation in that chamber could unravel the DNA of a human in hours. Yet the mouse moved with speed, with intent, with the agility of something that had learned to live with danger as a constant hum in the air. Where there's one mouse, there are more. And soon workers began spotting them in the lower levels, thin, ghost-like bodies slipping between pipes, scavenging insects from beneath warped steel, chewing on bits of moss that clung stubbornly to the walls. Some darted beneath the beams that once held control rods. Others climbed the stairs leading toward the old ventilation shafts. They were building colonies in places where no sunlight had touched since before the explosion. A generation born inside a graveyard for machines. But the most unsettling sound inside the reactor ruins was not the scratching of mice feet. It was wings, At first it was faint, a distant flutter, like paper shifting in a stale breeze. Then it became clearer, a chirp echoing through the vast hollow of the turbine hall, a rustle near the upper rafters, a small black shape moving along a beam high above the ruins. Birds, small blackbirds that had flown in through unseen cracks in the structure, finding a way to perch above the radioactive chambers. Their feathers darker than they should have been, their eyes sharper, their bodies lean and restless. They perched on rusted steel railings, hopping from one to another, feeding on insects that had no purpose outside surviving long enough to become something else's meal. Most birds would die instantly in such a place. But these did not. They returned. They nested. Their chicks hatched in the shadow of the world's most contaminated building. Their songs were warped, shorter, lower, as if echoing the warped frequencies of a place where physics once bent under the weight of catastrophe. The radiation didn't silence them. It shaped them. And then they found the fungus. At first glance, it looked like soot collected in the corners of the walls, dark patches growing like stains left behind by a long-dead fire. But under microscopes, the truth emerged. The fungus contained melanin, not a little, massive amounts, and that melanin wasn't protecting it from radiation. It was absorbing it, feeding on it, thriving on the very thing that destroys human bodies at the molecular level. It grew toward the gamma rays with intent, as if the energy was sunlight and the fungus was a plant stretching toward dawn. It spread slowly, creeping along broken walls, climbing up steel, forming velvet black coatings in some of the deadliest rooms ever built. A living organism feeding on the residue of atomic fire, a species that should never have existed, and yet there it was, thriving where everything else had collapsed into dust. Scientists studied it, they sampled it, they sent reports, but most of what they found was not released to the public, not because it was dangerous in the traditional sense, but because it forced a question no one knew how to answer. What happens when nature not only survives a nuclear meltdown, but begins to adapt around it? The deeper you imagine the reactor, the darker that question becomes. There are entire floors no one has entered since the disaster, rooms where even robots fail, hallways where radiation spikes so violently that electronics die the moment they cross the threshold. No one knows what grows in those sealed pockets now. No one has mapped the spaces beyond the collapsed chambers. No one has seen the crumbling rooms where molten core once dripped like blood from open wounds in the floor. But if spiders live in the upper chambers, if mice scurry across the lower drains, if birds nest above the turbine hall, if insects crawl through the cracks, if fungus feeds on the walls, what else has evolved in the shadows? What else has been reshaped by decades of exposure to energies that tear life apart and rebuild it in unpredictable ways? Life inside the reactor is not abundant, it is not safe, it is not normal, but it is real. A small, stubborn ecosystem carved out from the ashes of disaster, a miniature world where survival is not based on strength, but resilience, not on abundance, but adaptation. The creatures that live there are not thriving, they are persisting, changing, becoming something unique to that environment. Animals that tremble with the memory of a nuclear night, organisms sculpted by the invisible hand of radiation. The idea that the reactor is lifeless is a comforting lie. We want to imagine it as a sterile tomb, sealed and forgotten. But the truth is far stranger. The ruins are alive, quietly, slowly, uncomfortably, as if nature is reclaiming the one place on Earth that humans swore it could not. And the most haunting part is this: whatever lives there now is just the beginning. Radiation will continue to pulse in those chambers long after we are gone. The fungus will continue to spread. The insects will continue to adapt. The spiders will spin more warped webs. The mice will birth more pale descendants. The birds will sing more broken songs. The halls that once pulsed with atomic fire will grow their own strange forests of mold and shadow. Chernobyl is not dead. It is changing. And someday, centuries from now, when the concrete has crumbled and the steel has rusted away, the ruins will break open. What has evolved in the dark will meet the outside world. Creatures forged in shadow and silence will crawl toward the sun. And no one alive today will be there to see what the reactor has been shaping in secret, behind doors we were too afraid to open. The reactor is not a tomb, it is a womb, and something is still growing.